Welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. How are you, Eduardo?
I'm doing well, Damián. How's everything?
I'm good. I think you're in France. I hope you're safe from the fires.
I am. I'm in Bordeaux, which is not too far away from the fires, but fortunately, everything is, for us at least, good. It's pretty dramatic what is going on. Trains have been disrupted, roads have been disrupted, but we've been managing to get around it, and hopefully the weather will change and the fire will be under control soon.
I hope so as well. So this week, we have a great interview in the second part of the podcast with Gabriela Cámara. Gabi Cámara, as many of you will know, Gabi is the main owner and the co-founder and the CEO of Contramar. That's a restaurant group that includes Contramar, of course, Entremar, now Cantina Contramar in Las Vegas, Caracol, and some other restaurants. I think it's probably the most successful high-end Mexican restaurant group in Mexico, and it's helped, I think, popularize Mexican seafood around the world. It's become a tourist destination in its own right and remains a destination for Mexicans. And we're going to hear from Gabi what has made it such a success. First, Eduardo, let's chat about the news. I think we have the changes at BBVA, by some measures at least, Mexico's largest private company, by profits at least. Got some takeaways on the second quarter earnings season. More companies reported this week. We've got the Kia investment in electric car assembly in its existing plant in Monterrey, and some other stuff on the economy and Vulcan materials. Do you want to kick off, Eduardo, on BBVA?
Sure. Well, most of our listeners probably might have heard that BBVA changed the president of its board, Jaime Serrapuche, which had been heading that board for 19 years, will step down in September. And his place will be taken by Eduardo Osuna, who is been running the bank for the past few years in a very, very successful way. In addition to that move, obviously, as Osuna will be now chairing the board, José Luis, and I'm going to hope I can pronounce his last name correctly, is going to take the head of the top operative post in the bank. And his last name is Elechiguerra. José Luis Elechiguerra will be now heading the bank in Mexico. Both of the moves come as the BBVA bank, or the Spanish bank, is moving ahead or trying to quell or trying to use or trying to adapt to the new artificial intelligence environment in which we are. And both of the new top officials at the bank have engineering degrees, which I found that was quite interesting. Instead of having MBAs or economic degrees, they both have had engineering degrees, but have been in the financial world for a couple of decades in both cases. So it's going to be a challenge for them to keep running a bank as efficiently as has been run over the past 2 decades, I would say, or even more. From all metrics that you measured the development of the bank, it's been a very, very highly successful enterprise for the Spanish group here in Mexico. What can I say? Since Osuna became the chief operating officer of the bank, he has grown 129% in terms of assets, 160% in terms of total portfolio or asset base, 154% in terms of deposits. It tripled its capital. its earnings grew 3.4%, 3.4 times in those 15 years. So he has done a tremendous job, and I have no doubt that as president of the bank, will continue to steer it in the right way, despite all the challenges that the AI and the fintechs have brought to the system here in Mexico. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time. They come in at the right time with all the tools and the capacity and the size to continue growing. But obviously, new innovations will be required to take advantage of the new technologies that are coming to the market. Osuna also did a fantastic job in digitalizing the bank's operations, in creating the digital platform, which the clients use and cherish. There was a little bit of a mishap a few months ago, but nothing too serious, I would say. So we'll keep an eye and see how the bank continues to operate as both of them take the helm of the bank.
So Eduardo, I agree with everything you said. Perhaps the figure that investors are focusing on or have been focusing on is the absolute profits that BBVA Mexico generates. Last year it generated, there's different definitions, but 5.3 billion euros, maybe $6.5 billion of profit. I don't think any company in Mexico comes close to that. So just BBVA, if you put 10 times multiple on that, is worth $65 billion, which is roughly half the market cap of BBVA, which also has big businesses in Turkey, Spain, and South America. So and also interesting, I thought, he gave a presentation at their investor day that I think we talked about, and then how their market share, despite being the biggest bank back in 2020, has nonetheless grown. So their total loan market share has grown to 26% from 23. They're 40% of payroll lending and 30% of credit cards, and similar market share of deposits. So I think the issues you're going to deal with are the new José Luis Elechiguerra. They're going to have to deal with is one, as you said, maintaining that leadership, automizing processes using AI. As you mentioned, he's a chemical engineer. He actually has a PhD in chemical engineering from University of Texas. And more importantly, he was overall, before being head of risk at the BBVA group, he was overall head of engineering at BBVA. So he's pretty hardcore, it would seem from his CV, when it comes to AI and engineering. So that's a clear kind of message. That's the kind of person they want running a bank. So that's going to be an issue. I think he's very well qualified for that. The second issue, which any company that dominates its market is going to face, is competition, both from a regulatory perspective, because a lot of people complain that BBVA, being 25 to 30% of the Mexican banking system, has sort of created its own sort of bank within the banking system, and it's just cheaper to work and function within BBVA than be outside it. So they've created this moat thanks to their large market share, and maybe the regulators could be tougher in giving access to that. To that at lower rates, lower interchange rates on debit cards and stuff like that. So the competition policy. And then thirdly, and related to the first 2 points, the fintechs, especially Revolut and Nu, Plata, Klar, aggressively investing in Mexico. And when your margins are as high as BBVA's, there's always a risk that the newcomers, the disruptors, will go after clients that are very profitable, and even though they don't have your scale or your cost advantages, they're still profitable enough for them. And then when they get scale, as Nu has got in Brazil, they can match your profitability. So lots for him to do. And Osuna moving to the chairmanship, I think, also speaks well of the company. Although in the UK, it's somewhat frowned upon CEOs becoming chairmen of the board, so it kind of limits the freedom of the new CEO and kind of questions independence. But in the US, it's pretty common. So let's, if you agree, let's move on to some of the earnings results. I wanted to highlight just three, because there's too many to talk about in this podcast. One is FEMSA. It was interesting FEMSA, on the face of it, if you read the press release and listened to the conference call, they posted, very, very strong numbers. OXXO same-store sales growth was 9.5%. Average ticket was up 7%. Traffic was up 2%. And that's pretty amazing considering that ANTAD, is the average retailer in Mexico is growing, represented by ANTAD, is growing at 1 or 2%. So they had a blowout quarter when it came to sales. But as soon as they reported the stock has been falling, I think the market, first of all, it was priced in. The stock has been up 25, 30% this year. So people had very good expectations going into the numbers. I think, second of all, the call, they did say that a lot of the growth was World Cup related, people buying their beer before they watch the game. So they said that the second half won't be as good. And I think thirdly, there's a sense that FEMSA forward strategy, the unlocking value strategy of selling their stake in Heineken and other non-core assets and returning money via dividends and share buybacks, that's sort of coming to an end. And people like to sell on the news, buy on the rumor. So there's a sense that with the World Cup gone, the FEMSA unlocking value strategy mostly realized. There's not much left in it. I thought some of the interesting things on the conference call, which I was able to listen to, was they're making this big push in coffee, which is a relatively high margin business, and they say it's doing really well. So secondly, they are on the fintech side. They kind of warned, and maybe this is something else that longer term investors might be worried about. They warned that sort of payments is going to be commoditized, as every financial entity is going to give you the opportunity to pay your electricity bill or your phone bill for free. That's been a big source of profits for OXXO, as people go into OXXO and pay a high commission to pay off bills and transfer money. And they are therefore very focused on sort of monetizing their fintech business. It's been by OXXO. They've brought in, as we talked about, QED to help push credit, but it's untested. QED, they're not magicians either. They're with Cobalto, they're with Confio, relatively kind of medium-sized fintechs in Mexico, which haven't made the same kind of splash as a Nu or a Plata. And so I think people say, well, how easy is it going to be to go into the lending business? Obviously very different. FEMSA talked about it being, eventually off balance sheet, but, again, that's going to take some time. So I think the sort of concerns perhaps where the financial business is going, maybe that is difficult to tell because they've changed the way they report numbers, but maybe that weighed a bit on this decline in the gross margin at OXXO, 70 basis points, I think, which is sort of the one negative thing that came out of it. And then the other issue is, they talked a lot about being more competitive on pricing and more competitive on affordability, and the gross margin decline might reflect that. And people might be sort of concerned that sales will be growing, but margins will be coming down. And generally speaking, that's not a good mix for an investor who kind of prefers higher margins, which consume less capital than higher sales.
Yeah, I think Damián, in the case of FEMSA, OXXO was the brightest spot, and we had talked about the World Cup before, that it might not have had the impact that the government was expecting, or that some economists were wishing for. But in the case of OXXO, the results show that sales grew as people were celebrating the World Cup in a happy mood, as the World Cup turned out to be for many countries, Mexico included, despite its failure to move ahead. But it was probably an exception, and the officials of the company were warning that the impact would dissipate in the next few weeks. Maybe it is already happening, and so, like you said, the share price might be reflecting a one-off good result. And we've talked about how consumers in Mexico have become much more price conscious than before. And then again, what you just said about the pressure on the margins might be the reason why the shares have tumbled a little bit in the past few days. So, yeah, good numbers, but not necessarily a good year, although we'll talk about a bit of a good news later on the development of the Mexican economy.
Moving on to Cemex, another Monterrey company, they also reported very strong Mexico numbers. Are obviously a multinational at this point with revenues and businesses all over the place, but Mexico revenues are up 24%. And they talked very positively about, in their conference call, about Plan Mexico, how the government is using housing and infrastructure as economic growth levers, social housing, railways, highways, dams, more on the housing side. And you see that, with the numbers from some of the low-income housing companies, which are also pretty good, but also some of the railways and dam projects that are helping Cemex Mexico. They're also doing a good job at cutting costs, and that's leading to this pretty good improvement in margins. Now, the stock also didn't really move. I think a lot of this last year, Cemex stock doubled. So I think I'm assuming that quite a lot of this was already discounted in the numbers. And obviously, we've had a difficult couple of weeks in global markets, and fuel prices, which Cemex is sensitive to, because it uses a lot of energy to make cement, have also been going up. So it might be unrelated to the results, because the results were pretty impressive all round.
Yeah, they upped. They moved their guidance upward a little bit, thinking that the good execution of Plan Mexico will continue here. And I think that's the key point. And if what we are seeing in the economy, and if the Plan Mexico eventually becomes what it should become, and the probably a change of mood towards the future because of the economic development that Mexico managed to accomplish in the second quarter. I think Cemex is the one that will be probably more ready to profit from that. The government is announcing big plans for hospitals. A few days ago, they did announce a very aggressive plan to grow Mexico's health system, which requires probably to build more clinics and more hospitals. And so Cemex could be the provider, the supplier of the cement and other materials that are needed for such infrastructure projects. So let's see what happens. But the company is also saving, upgrading its guidelines for the future. So we might be talking about Cemex in a good positive light later in the second half of this year.
And then finally, Televisa. Televisa sort of historically had like a strong TV business and sort of struggling cable and telco internet business. And now things are changing a little bit, at least. They brought in new head of Izzy, a Brazilian, and the telco business is doing much better. China's below 2%, 5 quarters in a row. They've grown broadband subscribers for 5 consecutive quarters. The margin is up. They've slashed costs. I think they've taken headcount from 34,000 to 25,000. Programming costs have gone down. And they've also grown fiber to about 60% of houses that they covered, maybe 20% before. So there's the telco business, which we're all sort of waiting for this transaction to buy AT&T. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it's been talked about for a year now, is doing much better. But on the other hand, Televisa Univision, which is the content business, has struggled a lot in the US. Revenues were down a fair amount partly because they didn't win the World Cup, so they weren't able to broadcast it. Mexico, you saw very strong numbers from when it came to revenues, but they also, because of the World Cup, their costs also went up a lot. So there wasn't like a lot of growth on the overall cash flow of Televisa Univision, with the US definitely holding things back. But what struck me was this telco turnaround, which perhaps people haven't been giving kind of enough attention to, and if they do end up buying AT&T, then they'll be on a much stronger footing than they were a couple of years ago. It's much easier to take over a company if you're doing better than if you yourself are struggling.
It was interesting to me to see how different the television revenues from the Mexican side and the US side of their business came with the World Cup. Mexico was very, very successful, but the US was not. So that's unfortunate, but that's the way the two countries reflect on their passion for football, I guess, and the appetite for advertisers to reach the different audiences. And what you said about the telco, that's the telecommunications, that's the key. And we've been talking about it for quite a while now about the potential transaction with AT&T. I think that might be a key test for Televisa to continue moving their business ahead and changing some of the divisions that it has and make it more and more profitable as it has become a much more competitive ecosystem in all senses of the word, both the entertainment, television, as well as the telco business. There's lots of competition and then lots of people doing similar things to them. So it's tougher than ever for companies like Televisa to be able to grab eyeballs, as they were called when the internet.com existed. So we'll have to keep an eye on Televisa's continued plans to move forward and improve their different divisions.
Yeah, I was struck that Angoita in the conference call said they cut corporate expenditure, corporate, like a group of Televisa, neither at the telco nor at the television content side, spending from 1.2 billion pesos to 400 million pesos, which was a 65% reduction. I just don't understand what they were doing. This is over 3 years, I think. What they were doing, spending 1.2 billion pesos at the corporate, which doesn't, specifically manage businesses. I mean, maybe it's related to the spin-off of the sports and gambling, and so maybe it's a slightly misleading reduction. But even so, it's a massive reduction. And eventually, I think Televisa should just spin off to shareholders the telco business and spin off to shareholders the television business. There's no particular reason why those two businesses should sit together.
We'll see.
We'll see, and then they'd have no corporate spending no spending at the corporate level. So I think you looked into the Kia investment in Monterrey. Very precise number, $649 million.
Yeah, which is kind of a very unique number. But yeah, I mean, after a string of bad news in the auto industry here in Mexico, because we heard that Toyota was closing its plant in Tijuana, that GM had moved certain SUV productions to the States. The Toyota announcement in Tijuana was also related to start assembling the Tacoma pickup vehicle in San Antonio. After that, finally, yesterday, Kia Mexico, the subsidiary of the South Korean car maker, announced the investment number that you gave, $649 to be precise, $1 million, to start building their first 100% electrical vehicle here in Mexico at its Pesquerías Nuevo León plant. And I think everybody in the government was very happy to be able to share the news with the company, because obviously the auto sector is the one that has probably suffered the most from Trump's tariffs and antics against free trade. As we know, Mexican import cars that go to America face a 25% tariff on all the content except the U.S. content. So I read, I don't know if this is true, that that's about a 15% tariff, which is making people doubt whether to put assembly plants here or in the States. But Kia showed a sign of confidence, again, with a small vehicle that it will build here in Nuevo León. It's called the Kia EV3, which will be totally electric and which will be sold initially here in Mexico. It will generate 500 jobs in the first year, 1,500 from 2027 to 2030. So that's a 2,000 total number of new direct jobs. It's exactly a little bit of what the Toyota plant will generate in San Antonio. So it's a good news for the auto sector that Mexico can still attract investment and be able to build new models here. like GM had announced that it will transfer from China to Mexico these small cars that are very hard to make a profit on them. Only you can do it if you do it with your costs very much under control, mainly probably your labor costs. In that sense, Mexico is still far cheaper than the U.S. And so they are seeing they're still seeing that Mexico could provide some benefits, and I think the news is fortunate for Mexico, and we'll see whether other companies come to Mexico as well. There is another investment, apparently a $500 million investment from a company whose names has not been released by the Mexican authorities. But again, that might also bring a positive sign to an industry that has a tough year because of the Trump tariffs.
Yeah, I think we've said before that some of these announcements that are either re-announcements or are kind of optimistic spinning of numbers. So we always need to be a little bit skeptical. In this case, the investment was actually announced back in April by the governor, the controversial governor of Nuevo León, Samuel Garcia, when he was in Korea. At that point, he said it was going to be $600 million and that it was going to be Kia and its suppliers. And at that point, it was just the plant expansion of the Pesquería plant, a new production line in effect. And it was going to be, I think, 300 jobs, which was what was reported. Now we're up to 649, but we're also including investments in charging infrastructure, solar panels, water treatment investments. Maybe that explains some of the increase. The job increases may be also explained by that. The content, is still relatively low, 27% Mexican content, which also means that as going forward, there's an opportunity to increase that, because Mexico right now isn't that strong when it comes to electric car supply chain. So I think most of GM's supplies will also come from Asia, in that case, most likely from China. Here maybe from China as well as Korea and other places. But I think, as you say, we're seeing a kind of reconfiguration of the car industry. Mexico's probably a little bit of a net loser, but it's not all negative. So from what I read, these cars will be for the Mexican market and South America. They won't be for the US. BMW, which produces in San Luis electric cars, going to be, but they don't meet the USMCA rules of origin, unfortunately. So those are going to be re-exported back to Europe for the most part. So clearly the US market, based on what GM has announced, what Toyota has announced, what BMW is doing, and then these other investments, Mexico's becoming less appealing for that market because of tariffs. It stands to reason. But they're using Mexico for South America, Europe, Mexico itself, and clearly the US continues, but perhaps just not as dominant as it used to be. And we also have the Nissan news when they closed the Civic plant in Morelos, right? And concentrated everything in Aguascalientes. So a lot of movements. I think that they're not only related to tariffs; they're also related to other issues. But but tariffs is one of them. And Mexico is very good at assembling cars. It needs to be better on the supply chain for electric cars. But clearly, that's the goal of Plan Mexico for that to happen.
Correct.
So, should we move on just to some quick takes? I would say we've got some good news on GDP. GDP growth for the second quarter was quarter on quarter seasonally adjusted 1.5. Bloomberg consensus was about 1.3. And I think people will recall that in the first quarter we had a contraction of 0.6. So annual GDP expanded 2.2. And versus annual growth of 0.2. So Wall Street economists this morning were speaking on Thursday, July the 30th, are raising a little bit their expectations for the full year. Things are getting better at the economy level, and that might explain one of the sort of conundrums that we had, which is why our exports were so strong. We get early data on exports, and yet the economy wasn't moving at all. Well, the economy is clearly still underperforming most other emerging markets, but it's doing a bit better than we thought, and that may be driven in part by the very strong exports. And on that subject, Mexico reported very good trade surplus, if you think that's a good thing. In June, it was surplus of $4.1 billion from 2.3, and exports surged year on year to 30%. Imports also grew year on year 28%, but that gap, when the absolute export and import numbers are so huge, leads to a very big increase in the overall surplus.
I would just add on the GDP number, Damian, if we annualize the 1.5 as the US does, Mexico's growth rate would have been 6.1%, which would be the highest recorded in 5.5 years. I don't think we were thinking of such a rapid expansion. Wonder if it's a one-time growth spark, or whether it will continue in the future. But it's a solid number if you take it from all perspectives, and more than anything, it was above analyst expectations, which is gonna be interesting to see how they update their figures for the rest of the year.
That's right. And the US also just reported second quarter, and those numbers were weak. So I think a lot is you had this very weak first quarter, bounce back in the second. There's really need to look at the first half to get a better picture, because there could be some sort of month by month variations that explain that. First half weak growth still very weak, but not as weak as perhaps some economists thought. From my side, the Vulcan arbitration, which has been going on for some years, Vulcan Materials, big US company based in Alabama, very powerful politically in the US, especially in Alabama, because I think it's the largest company there. So senators in Alabama are going to pay attention to what Vulcan has to say. And they had their sort of mine or quarry in the Quintana Roo effectively closed by the López Obrador administration. They sued under NAFTA, not under USMCA, for $1.7 billion. And they basically lost. They're only going to receive $15 million, less than 1%. And the only issue on which they won, which presumably is what drove the $15 million, was in fact actions taken by Peña Nieto back in 2018. So on all the AMLO issues where they put in sort of environmental protections to stop the mining from going on, the Vulcan loss. Now, I think that they haven't made public the reasoning behind the dispute, so this is somewhat speculative, but it's worth pointing out that USMCA very substantially weakened investment protection for US and Canadian investors in Mexico versus NAFTA. And certain investments that were made before USMCA came into place, like Vulcan's, were still able to sue under NAFTA, but stuff that was done after 2020 increasingly has to be covered by USMCA. Trump's view then, and the reason why they did this, and Lighthouse's view was, we don't want people to invest in Mexico, so why would we protect Americans from doing that? Why would we bail them out? So, they should go in, caveat emptor, and face the consequences of the Mexican legal system. So they didn't want to promote U.S. investment in Mexico. So it was very, very conscious, very, very deliberate. But that does mean it's going to be more of a challenge for Vulcan to win against the Mexican government under USMCA. Of course, we might get another USMCA over the next few months because of that. So basically, USMCA kind of covers your arbitration when it's energy related or government related, or regulation related, but not so much mining. So it might be explained by that. But anyway, they lost. I think most people in the private sector had assumed that Vulcan was gonna win. And I think Vulcan assumed that they were going to win. They were quite defensive on their conference call about this, saying that they were disconcerted with the results and said they still owned the land. I think it puts Chairman in a stronger position to negotiate something that could work for both sides, because the alternative no longer is losing $1.5 billion. So maybe Vulcan will be a bit more amenable to some kind of negotiated solution where they can mine somewhere else, or mine in a more environmentally friendly way.
Correct. Shall we move to Gabi, Damian?
Sounds good. So our guest today is Gabi Cámara. a friend of mine and one of the most influential restaurateurs to come out of Mexico in recent years. How are you, Gabby?
I am very well. Very happy to be speaking with you, Damián. Thank you.
The pleasure is mine. So, Gabby, I think a lot of people listening to this will know she opened Contramar with her partners back in 1998. So, in 2 years, it'll have its 30th anniversary. I think Gabby was 22. She had no formal culinary training or experience running a restaurant. And 3 decades later, almost 3 decades later, it's become Mexico's kind of defining restaurant and a genuine international institution. Her group, which is called Red Contramar, now includes Contramar, Entremar in Polanco, Caracol de Mar, Itacate, and also a big catering business. And then they've just opened in Las Vegas, Cantina Contramar in the Fontainebleau hotel. But anyway, today we're not going to talk a lot about recipes, tuna tostadas or pescada a la talla, as much as I would like to, but more about the business of Red Contramar, why it succeeded, why it's endured, a little bit about the expansion in the US. I should disclose that I know, as Gabby knows, obviously, Contramar quite well. In fact, a few years back, one of the waiters said to me, Senor Fraser, I think you're the person who spent most money at Contramar. And so much
We
so that
thank you profusely.
so much so that my then wife christened Contramar as Contra Moi. So I may not be the only person who generated differences in their household for frequenting Contramar. So anyway, it's a business podcast. So, and I imagine that some of these questions, some of this information you're not able to disclose, but to the extent that you are, maybe we could kick off just with the scale of the business. How many people roughly do you employ? How many tables do you serve across Red Contramar? Maybe a ballpark number for revenues or something of that nature, just so people can get a sense of the scale of the business.
Actually, we were just. I mean, thank you, and it's really quite extraordinary that Mexico City has become this very lively city, and we were part of the World Cup. What is it? Venues, and I was just looking at numbers of how our group, not magically, it's a lot of work, but it does consistently well. Because I think because of two factors. First, because it's not the fussiest food. Second, because the service is incredible. And not the fussiest food means that people can relate to it and can go often. It's not a one time in your week restaurant or in your month or in your year. People tend to come a lot. And thank you for being a very good example of that, Damián. But we were just looking at our seating capacity in Contramar has always been around 160 people, give or take, because at some points we had more chairs. As you know, in Mexico, we have this sobremesa concept. But in terms of people, in terms of seating, we do in Contramar we have an average of around 750 people a day, which is huge. 750, yeah, 750. No, sorry. No, I'm looking at these numbers. Yes. No, this is on weekends. And we have, during the weekdays, which is Monday through Friday, we have an average of 350 around. So it's very different on weekends than weekdays, which is more business people and shorter meals. Yeah, even the times that we open are less. And the Contramar and Entremar have very similar numbers. And Caracol de Mar is a smaller restaurant, and that has a higher check average. However, it's not that much higher, and the number of people in Caracol, and this is this past Mundial season, which is never a good season. World Cups are never a good season for us. It's in the summer, and it's been raining cats and dogs in Mexico City, and it's been very difficult to mobilize oneself, to move in the city. So it's not been a good summer in terms of business in general, of the food business. But we do have Caracol de Mar has about 180 seat. 180. The seating is 80 people, and then we have an average of 180 per day. And that includes weekends. It's very steady, and that was the case over these past months. So it's very accurate and recent information I'm giving you, and it has to do with. I think it's a very interesting economic factor, but the World Cup was announced as millions and millions of visitors to Mexico and huge businesses. And we always knew that World Cup is not a good season because people in Mexico really do watch soccer games, and most people football. Sorry, but I forget that British people are civilized, and you invented football, so we don't have to say soccer for you to understand. Sorry. Anyway, in Mexico, people really take football seriously. So they don't go out, they stay at home, they organize family gatherings, friend gatherings. But in any case, these are our numbers this year with given the World Cup and the difficulties in transportation and everything. And we also have Castacan. Castacan is our Yucateco little taqueria torteria concept, and that's super popular. And that was very popular these days. And we have about 45 seats there. No, less. We have 40 seats. And we always have over 100 people coming daily. And some days we've reached numbers of like 500, which is crazy. And let's see, what else do we have? In the Vegas restaurant, the Vegas restaurant is 120 seats. And it has been packed since the day we opened at the end of March. And in the United States, they have a more regular seating or eating time, right? In the United States, people do not know about this concept that you very well are acquainted with, which is sobremesa, which you just linger and then might eat something 3 hours after you've already finished your meal, or not, or just kept on hanging around at the table. And that allows for more visitors to come into Cantina Contramar. So in Cantina Contramar, we have an average of about, I think, what was it? 480 or something like that, which is really high, really, really high. What am I missing?
Contramar, assume it's relatively similar. Entremar, Contramar.
Yes, very.
What people spend like $100 a head, roughly? What's the kind of spend per head?
The kind of spend per head is, yes, it's a little bit over $100 per person.
Brilliant. Now, I was, before this conversation, asking people the question that you get asked, I guess, every day, probably, like the secret of your success, the secret of the success of Contramar. And one person said something I thought was interesting. They said, a lot of people underestimate that what Gabby's really, really good at is running a business more than being an innovative chef. She, to some extent, inherited a brilliant menu, had the intelligence to keep it, and has run the business, far better than anyone else ran it before her, or other people running to similar types of restaurants. Do you think that that's a fair characterization of obviously there are many factors behind your success, but one of the key factors that you're pretty good at running a business more than being an innovative chef?
Absolutely. Because I've never pretended to be an innovative chef. I just put things that I think make sense together. And I did make the original menu of Contramar. Even though Federico was in the kitchen, it was a menu that I very much curated because that's what I'm good at. I think I studied, when I finished university, I thought I was going to be working in contemporary art. I thought I was going to direct an art institution, and basically I wanted to be a curator. And I think that's what I basically do in my business. You curate what's on the menu, what's on the walls, but what are the chairs like? What does the menu look like? And then you run it in an organized fashion. And it's not that difficult to be able to, if you're attentive and you're there, it's not that difficult to know what works and what doesn't. It's very obvious. Right? People, one of the things I like the most about this business, and I knew nothing about it when I started, we opened Contramar as a complete experiment. And we didn't even know if it would, like, we had no perspective of anything. We didn't run any numbers other than, okay, the construction is this, we need to buy this, we have the money, let's do it. And of course, we've been, over the years, we've improved our equipment, we've improved so many things. We've all learned and grown and become professionals, right? So at this point, I would say I completely am a restaurateur that can professionally be very proud of her accomplishments. But when we opened, we had no idea. But what we did know was what we wanted to give this city that did not exist then. And we did know how we like to eat. And I've always been very good at that. Ever since I can remember, I was good at figuring out what should come first, what should go after. This doesn't go well with this. In terms of food, I've always been super picky, but always a very good, very, very, very good eater. People have always been impressed at how much I do eat. I still really do eat a lot, and I really enjoy it. And I love people enjoying themselves while they're eating. And I love to create that atmosphere in which you create a chain of value for everybody who's involved in the process, right? I was always very aware of the sustainability and the origin of our produce. I think much more so than any of my original partners. So that was always something that I pushed and keep on pushing. And the menu, again, it's a very simple menu. Contramar has a menu that is something that you could eat on a palapa on the beach. It wasn't genius. We just tweaked things and made it a little bit more sophisticated or a bit more high quality, but it's not different from a pescado a la talla that you can have on a palapa on the beach alongside, on the Pacific coast. If you go to Troncones and you have fresh baked tortillas and beans and fish, it's not that different. Maybe the sauces vary, but and the quality, I have really pushed on the quality. The quality of what we serve is really top notch. And I think that and the fact that it's easily relatable, that people can really eat it without having to think that much. It's just delicious food. And I know saying that sounds superficial, but the fact that people can eat it without just an enjoyment is a very good business strategy, because you don't have to, people. And then if you have great service, and we always knew we wanted extremely good service. And in Mexico, we have a tradition of really good service and people making a living that is very dignified for them. So they've been working with me. I have servers that have been working with me since less than a month into having opened Contramar. Ramon, you can of course know him. And and it's just a matter of, I completely agree that my ability is being a good restaurateur. Alice Waters from Chez Panisse in Berkeley always says that we should say we're restauratrices, not restaurateurs, because we have to acknowledge our gender.
You mentioned some of the other restaurants, Entremar, Caracol, and so on. Is Red Contramar, do you manage them as one business? Are they individual restaurants with their own shareholders and their own profit and loss statement? Is there an interchange of people between one place and another? Do you think being part of this Red makes it much stronger than being individual?
Actually, yes. The Red, I mean, yes to many of the things that you said. So they are run individually. The profit and loss are individual. The partners are basically the same, but not that we have a few that have different percentages or different partners, or actually just, Casacan is a different partnership. And Contramar is a different partnership than the rest, because it's only Pablo and myself. That's just the way we left it from the beginning. And the red is the part that administers all the restaurants. So that runs, the financials and the business plans and the sort of the central office that manages. And the red is also, it has to do with our purveyors and the way we manage the purveyorship, because that's a really big part of the business, how we have all our agreements with the different farmers and the different, and for example, we have how we buy their crops, or we advance and we help them build their business on their own. And we do that with certain fisheries as well. And I'm sorry that today I have a really bad sore throat, so I'm struggling with my voice, but I hope I'm being clear. Anyway, they are run as individual businesses, but the red sort of covers them in terms of a standard of quality, a standard in operation in terms of how we manage human resources and how we deliver our payments to everybody who sells to us, and how we concentrate a few of our acquisitions so that it's more convenient. So we have the best of both worlds. When we need to be independent, we're independent, and every restaurant has its personality and its different people, and not every member of the team goes everywhere, but a few of the managers do go everywhere, and there are a few people who do run the whole red, such as Armando Camacho, who's the maître by excellence. Everybody knows him. He has a bit of himself everywhere in terms of service, and he establishes many of the policies in all of the restaurants. But in general, we do have individual management and very specific recipes and products for the different restaurants.
So moving, Gabby, to internationalization and the opening in March in Vegas. I mean, there's different questions I have. I mean, first, 20 years ago, as far as I can recall, everyone globally talked about, in Latin America, Peruvian food. And now they talk much more about Mexican food. And Contramar, I think, at least played a part in that. Why do you think sort of high-end Mexican food has been able to transform its image when the underlying food is pretty much the same over this 2 decades of history?
Well, I think that one of the things that really helped Contramar when we opened is that we had this sort of foreign vision. Not that, and that we want, Mexican restaurants in the at the end of the 20th century were either tourist traps or very traditional places where you would only eat Mexican food, and it wasn't, or certain fondas that weren't even considered, anything to write home about. And when we opened Contramar, it was categorized, which is really interesting, as Mediterranean. And we always had fresh made tortillas, which is a very Mexican thing. And eventually, I think with the trend, this was the peak of molecular gastronomy, right? Molecular gastronomy, 50 courses at the Bulli, at El Bulli, Ferran Adrià, transforming food with science. And I think in the international global trend, Contramar the trend sort of catched up with Contramar, which was basically just really simple food. And it happened to be Mexican because it was Mexican, because we were serving Mexican food, because we had no doubt that Mexican food was delicious. And we had no need to want to be European or to want to be Chinese or to want to be Japanese. And we were part of that sort of 90s fusion movement where you had Asian and, Asian influences everywhere, and everybody started to eat tuna when before nobody wanted red meat. Everybody wanted a white piece of, a white slice of fish, and before sushi. I think we did it at the right time in a way that was unpretentious. And I think eventually when the really high-end chefs started to pay attention to Mexican ingredients, after the trend of René Redzepi opening in Noma, this restaurant in Copenhagen, and making Copenhagen food when Denmark had never been known for their food. And now I think tourism in Denmark has gone up. I think 60% of people who go to Denmark go because of the food. And I mean, and Denmark has 1,000 wonderful things, but one of the very incredible innovations in terms of food was the interest in locality and the interest of sort of, every good cook has always known it, but to make a trend out of being local and being sort of, and highlighting your identity or working your identity through food, I think is now a very clear trend in food, and it's a trend in other things in the world, but I think in food it's very clear. And it just happened to be that Contramar was already there. Contramar was already working with corn, maize producers that were growing native heirloom corn. We were already working with all these farmers and fisheries that were cooperatives that were being fair, were being paid fair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think it's a question of luck and commitment to making it better every day. Sort of being in the right place at the right time, and also just knowing that what you do is valuable and you want to do it better because it's important to many people.
And do you think, on that note, do you think that one can run a successful high-end great Mexican restaurant outside Mexico, given that the food availability is different, labor costs are different? Because maybe for COVID-related reasons, you had two, if I remember rightly, you had two other restaurants, Ola in LA and Cala in San Francisco, that are no longer operating. I mean, do you think it's a real challenge to sort of move the Contramar or Red Contramar model to the US?
No, actually, I think, Cala was a good business. Cala closed because after the pandemic, we turned it, I came back to live in Mexico, and we turned it into it was a conjunct operation. San Francisco had a complete lockdown, and we had to change the way it was operating, so it became more of a dining place for people who didn't have a home where they could eat with their families, and it was paid for by the city, and Food for Soul and Refectorio, Massimo Bottura, the chef Massimo Bottura from Modena, his organization with Lara Gilmer, his wife, to feed people that can't eat well in big cities, basically. So we had all these NGOs that were running it, and I didn't want to go back to San Francisco to open Cala when you could. So, because it really, restaurants, so I think two things. In Cala, I managed to make a successful operation because also I managed to have really good service through a hiring policy that was kind of off the beaten track, but turned out to be extraordinary, which was I hired people who had a conviction history and could not find a job, and the city gave them a little help so that they could work. It's kind of a scholarship to find work to stop recidivism, because people go in and out of jail, and it's a whole judiciary issue in the United States, in San Francisco and California specifically. They wanted to do something about that, and the city managed to give inmates who had served their time and had done well or whatever, or had certain abilities that would help them in their sort of reestablish their lives outside of jail. They gave them a little scholarship so that they could, and they made all these work fairs. So I went to them and I found all these people that were willing to learn, and the city would pay for half of their training period, and I would invest in their training period. And then have people who really cared about their jobs, because it was probably the only job they could get. So that was really smart in terms of what it generated in terms of a community around Cala. And we did have the best produce, and cooking in San Francisco was one of the greatest pleasures of my life, because the quality of the ingredients there is just really spectacular. And Mexico is very, very close to that, because you have all these Mexicans cultivating the lands in California. So you have access to so many chiles and Mexican ingredients that you have no idea. But for example, and I think we've seen examples of very successful restaurants. You have one in London, Santiago's restaurant. I think it's all a matter of how much you spend and how much you charge. And if there's a demand for it, you can charge what you need to charge, and then it works. But if there isn't a demand for it, but I do believe that more and more you have taquerias everywhere, and the concept, at least in the United States, the concept that Mexican food is cheap is still weighing, but it's weighing less and less because high end is now available online, and people learn about different places in the beat, just by scrolling on their Instagram or whatever platforms there are, which are 1,000, and people are obsessed with food, and it's become a trend. And I think, I do think that restaurants outside of Mexico, high-end Mexican restaurants, can be more and more successful because the concept of Mexican food is becoming more, as you were saying, Peruvian food had a thing of being much more high-end. And I do think it was in everyday terms, Peruvian food was much more refined in terms of their understanding of what it could be and their deliverance in terms of like aesthetically in the restaurants and the dishes, the way it was presented and whatnot. And Mexican food was sort of everyday. Oh yeah, if you go to a town wherever, in a lost town in any of the Mexican states outside of Mexico City, you could find delicious food, but it wasn't the pretentious Mexican high-end food that you now do find in sort of fancy restaurants outside of Mexico and in Mexico City. I think Contramar really did amount to that being possible. Just to having Mexican food be comparable or just considered another way of, or just, grading. I mean, trends have to do with so many things. We could go on forever about why I think Mexican food has become trendy, but I do think that it just fits so many descriptions or it just fits this world in which we want to learn about what we didn't know before or what was in front of us and we didn't regard as important. And, the sort of everyday, the everyday food of Mexicans, especially, I insist, especially in the United States, was always regarded as kind of the lowest of the low. And now that the Mexicans are second or third or fourth generation in the United States and they can eat better quality meat with their tortillas, and the taco becomes ribeye instead of whatever scraps you had, then you can make in Cantina Contramar, we have the most ridiculous ribeye tacos, and we have the most ridiculous steak with different salsas. And I think it's a matter of quality, and it's a matter of being able to make the public want a certain type of food. And it's a fad, and it has to do with how you market it, and it has to do with, again, with all the complexities that marketing does bring to our consumers, to consumers' opinions, to our choices.
I read or heard somewhere that Cantina Contramar in Vegas has a slightly different business model to Ola or Cala, that the much higher capital costs associated with a restaurant in the US, higher rent, higher labor costs, those kind of risks are not being borne by you, but by the majority shareholders. Do you think that in retrospect, with the experience that you've had in these at least three restaurants in the US, is the right way to go about sort of US expansion, working with kind of US partners?
Well, another thing, Onda in LA was a restaurant where I consulted for, I think, a year before it opened in terms of the menu, but I was never really a very active part in that restaurant. And it closed that did close because of the pandemic. And I do think that I don't know how long it would have kept on running if it hadn't been for the pandemic. That's sort of the more iffy. Gala, if it would have been for the pandemic, I think we could have figured it out because it had a really special place in that community. Cantina Contramar, after I closed Cala and I was in Mexico City, and I said, I don't want any restaurant that is not where I am and where I can be. I don't want an expansion. I don't want a chain. I don't want to be going back and forth. I don't believe in restaurants restaurants do not operate on their own, not special restaurants. Maybe chains do, but I'm not interested in that. And Cantina Contramar happened because Berta Gonzalez from Casa Dragones, this incredible Mexican businesswoman who created this brand of tequila after having worked in Cuervo for many years, introduced me to these owners of the Fontainebleau who had the location in Miami, were working on the location, were about to open in Las Vegas, and because of the trend, they were into checking out a Mexican trendy place as much as they were checking out, a Korean trendy place, a steakhouse, an Italian trendy place. I don't know, all the other things, they were checking all the boxes. But now, yes, the Mexican high end is a box that people want to check. But I always say Contramar is not high end food. Not even Caracol is a little bit more high end, but it's not that high end. It's not that, it's simple, good food that you can present in beautiful ways, but it's not about the presentation. It's about the taste, and it's about the way that you can eat it. So anyway, they fell in love with Contramar. They wanted Contramar, and they convinced me, they operate. And I think that the difficulty with running restaurants, is that you depend on people. Your biggest resource is the team. And it's also your biggest nightmare because you depend on so many people that you have no control over. And I think that the fact that in Vegas, you have a population of professionals, food professionals, and industry super experts for decades. Now they have more people go to Las Vegas for shows and food than for gambling. So they have all these people live there. It's a city where they can buy a home, send their families, give their families a higher level than in other cities and states for whatever financial reasons that are also complicated because it has to do with the federal, the way the United States work in terms of taxes and different taxes for the different states, whatever. But in Las Vegas, you do have a population of people who are willing to work in this industry, whereas in other states, it's very difficult to have young people wanting to be servers. Nobody wants to be a server. Now people want to be a chef because it's become trendy to be a chef. But I always say working in restaurants is like wanting to work in the construction business, not as an owner, but as a constructor, and it's not sophisticated. It's not chic. It's not, you're not, it's hard. It's hard work. It's physical labor. It's intense mentally and physically and in every way. And I think that it requires people who are very committed and in love with this industry. And in Las Vegas, we found that. And I think that makes sense. But I don't know that I would want to make restaurants everywhere else. I think restaurants are such weird beasts. I mean, restaurants really do belong. I mean, and there are different types of restaurants. And I think there are so many examples, of wonderful chain concepts. I'm always impressed, for example, by the Shake Shack model or by Pret-a-Porter. Pret-a-Porter was a very successful concept when I was, I think, opening Contramar already. So it's been around for quite some time. I don't even know what state it's at now, but they sort of they've been on point with the trends, and they've also been on point with the numbers. And it's not easy because so many times good restaurants aren't that good of a business or aren't as sustainable as businesses. I think one of the mistakes is that people who go into restaurants not knowing about the industry and thinking it's going to be a good business are very mistaken, completely mistaken. People invest in restaurants thinking they're going to make money. And I think you should invest in restaurants because you want to have a restaurant, or you want to support somebody making the restaurant. And if it's a business, wonderful. And I think there are very smart ways in which to make it a business, but it's as any other business. And it's just the difficult part of restaurants is that people, I learned when we opened Contramar that in Mexico, the businesses that opened and closed the most were restaurants, food businesses, and beauty parlors, or, manicure places, or sort of, and I think these are two such everyday needs that people have, that everybody thinks it's easy. Everybody thinks you go to a restaurant thinking that you're going to eat well, and the most likely thing is that you won't eat well, because there are so many factors along the line that can make your experience terrible, that it's a real challenge. It's a real feat to feed people well in big numbers. So, or maybe in big numbers, it finally does get easier, but it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge. And it's a lot of teamwork. And that's why, again, I do agree with you. I think what I'm best at is at building teams and running the restaurant in a way that can keep on going.
Gabby, if we switch to gentrification in Mexico City, which has become a hot political subject recently, I mean, you, and more importantly, the hundreds of people that you employ from all types of economic and social backgrounds, have been big beneficiaries of gentrification in terms of tourists coming to Mexico City and eating in Contramar, and then affluent people from outside Condesa Roma coming into Condesa Roma that they didn't used to do 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, are you pro gentrification? Are you worried that gentrification could change the nature of these neighborhoods like Condesa, Roma, Juarez?
I mean, I've lived in Condesa Roma for the past 30 years, and I've seen the gentrification happen, but I've been part of the gentrification. So to be pro or for, for gentrification or against gentrification is very difficult in my situation. I think, Mexico City has always been a cosmopolitan city, and it has been much more gentrified. And I think the situation after the pandemic changed dramatically because of the nomad, what is it?
Digital nomads.
Digital nomads establishing um, uh, here. But also, I think the pandemic was a really extraordinary opportunity for people, young, trendy, or people in the arts or fashion, to get to know Mexico City, because as the border, remember the borders in the United States were closed, or people had to have a quarantine period of 10 or 15 days, I forget, before coming from Asia or from Europe, before entering the United States. And many people chose Mexico City as a very logical geographical pre-United States destination. And that really exposed Mexico City to a public that had never been to Mexico City, had maybe heard of it. But that, with social media and Mexicans being so sort of ready to fill demand, I think has made for a very good business for so many people. I do think it's a bubble that eventually will sort of adjust, because I do believe that even though so many extraordinary restaurants have opened, also so many really bad restaurants that won't last have opened. And you can see it, right? But the way we live has changed. And I think, and there are studies of how, in big cities, eating at places, outside of home actually is more sustainable. So I do think that it's the way that the way that people live has changed, especially in certain areas of the city. And I think, again, to be pro gentrification or against gentrification, I'm pro Pacific and fair conviviality. I think we shouldn't all speak English in Mexico City. And I think if you come from abroad and want to learn about the culture, as so many foreigners have always done in Mexico, welcome. But if you're Mexican and you're against gentrification, it's also very non-consistent with what the country has been. Mexico has always been a country that has welcomed people. And I mean, for good or worse. I do believe also we've suffered the worst of colonialism, and we still do, but also we have the benefits of exchange and plurality and cultural enrichment. I don't know.
Last
I
question.
myself, I'm sort of half Mexican, half not. So I feel that I can very clearly say this to anybody. I feel very Mexican, and I feel very welcome in Mexico. And I've always done my due to be welcomed in Mexico. But I do understand how people can be very upset by certain foreigners coming to Mexico and sort of owning without being as respectful. I don't know. I understand both sides.
Do you sometimes worry that too many foreigners are going to Contramar and it's changing the nature of the
The
restaurant?
demographic. Oh, I totally do. And I've always worried. In fact, one of the things that happened during the World Cup is that as we only take reservations up to a certain point. We always have sort of half the restaurant without reservations, so that Mexicans who don't make reservations with so much anticipation can walk in, and we always have tables for walk-ins. And when during the World Cup, when Mexicans were not going anywhere, it was only there were times of the day where it was only Americans, or only people, or only foreigners. But in Contramar, this has been happening for over 20 years. We extended our times of operation to open earlier, and we always called it the United Nations shift. So we had that sort of early lunch, and then Mexicans would come for their regular lunch between 2:30 and 3, and that was where they would linger and eat for longer periods of time. And then now we've extended, and then later we extended it to an early dinner, which worked for Americans, but no Mexican ever would come to dinner. No Mexican would have come to dinner to Contramar. Actually, at the beginning, when we opened Contramar, it was open for lunch and dinner. And we closed dinner because the food is not food that Mexicans would have traditionally had for dinner. Now we have that, Americans come or tourists come for dinner, and we close our kitchen at 8, and it gives them enough time to have dinner while Mexicans are finishing their lunch. So it's kind of a mixed. It's always been a very mixed place, Contramar, but since it opened, it's been a mixed place. I have to say, it isn't just from the pandemic. Of course, it's increased in immensely, the amount of foreigners and the line outside before it opens. I can't even believe that happens. I think it's completely absurd, but they do it, and it's fine. And I do know that many Mexicans are upset by that, because Mexicans want to go to restaurants where they see other Mexicans, where they're not having to be exposed to Americans who don't know how to eat the way we eat, or especially Americans, but in general, foreigners. And I think that at Contramar, we try to do a good job at teaching foreigners who don't know about Mexican ways, how we eat here. But it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge. And as a business, you want customers. So it's very difficult to say, oh, we don't want you, or we're going to charge you more. We've thought of this, and I have all these meetings with restaurants, with colleagues, and we always think, well, should we charge differently to locals? And you can't do that officially, because that's also discrimination. So we don't do that. But I do think that in my case, it's always important to treat Mexican guests, especially guests that have been regulars, very specially, always, even if they're Americans that are spending more money, or they're coming more often, or I think it's important to treat all your guests with great respect and gratitude, because that's why you can keep on existing. So I don't know. We have a very democratic policy, and I think it might alienate some guests, but on the other hand, what can you do?
I guess what you could do is, and maybe it's what you're doing with Caracol and Entremar, although that's been around forever, is segment the market a bit, and you have the sort of flagship, which has the brand. And someone once told me that in Mexico, there's two mandatory stops if you're a tourist. One is the Museo de Antropología, and the other is Contramar.
I am so flattered by that, and they do tell me that, and it is the biggest compliment that I have. I never imagined that would be the case, but I am so proud of that.
Well, you should be. Last question, Gabby. I mean, in the previous administration, you were, I believe, briefly an advisor to the president. In fact, you told him to close down if I remember rightly, the tourism promotion agency, which wasn't working very effectively. And then you also advised the current president when she was mayor of Mexico City on bringing tourism and cultural issues to Mexico City. You're fascinated by business, by sustainability, by social mobility. You have this kind of, if you go to Contramar, talking about United Nations here, it's a United States of Mexico, in the sense that you have people from every state and every social background working in front or back or in the middle. Do you have any ambitions to parley those talents to public affairs?
No, I was very much I was very much a supporter of the government changing in Mexico, and I think, and I still am, and I think it's had its I think it's had its great successes, and also there's still so many things to fix, and I will always support governments that want to that want to make citizens' lives better. And I do think I have a certain ideology, or I think my ideology does align with the current president's in terms of it's so complicated. But I do think, I'm interested in the world in general, as you say, in so many in social issues and political. Mexico is such a presidentially dependent country that it's very important who's running. The president really does run the country on many grounds, even though Trump says the narcos run our country, and in a way they also do, unfortunately. But I will support any government, and I will support any politician that I can collaborate with and who I respect. But I have no intentions of being in politics myself. And it was very clear to me very soon that I had nothing to do there, and that I'm always going to be a fighter for any right that I think citizens should have. And in food, it's been very interesting to be a part of the discussions around, for example, when the pandemics began, when the pandemic began in the city, and Claudia made the very smart decision of opening restaurants so that they could have, or giving the restaurants the possibility of opening terraces outside on the street where cars would park. I think not la ciudad al aire libre. That was a very good policy that I participated in, and I was very close to her while all that was happening. And the popular dining, los comedores populares, in the different areas in need of the city. And so I've always been very active, and I always think that Contramar has a fortune of being very popular, because otherwise it would be an NGO, because that's more of what I relate to. But I am good at making things that people like, and I do think that politicians should be much more aware of what people in businesses are doing, and how good businesses, or businesses that can be sustainable, or more, and that make the cities and the country work, are doing. And I think that's the interest that the interest that I have in politics is the interest that I have in the world being a better place, even if it sounds very sort of very basic. But I do have hopes of this world becoming a better place, even if we have so many confirmations of it not being a better place.
Gabby, thank you so much for that interview.
You're so welcome.
Well, thanks for joining us for this week's episode. Hope to have you back next week. Please review us, share us, and keep listening.